name is Sarah Honigfeld. Meeting is being recorded. This is my sign name, Sarah, because I'm always excited, so I got this sign name. Thank you for inviting me tonight and being able to talk about IFSPs and advocacy. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm qualified to even talk about this subject tonight. And then I'm going to have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to go through the IFSP and advocacy. I am a deaf adult. I was born deaf. I grew up bilingual, signing as well as spoken English and learning to read and write in English. And in going into college, well, I was born in Connecticut and I grew up in Connecticut. Some of you may be familiar with the American School for the Deaf in Connecticut. That was the first school for the deaf in the entire country. And I did attend the American School for the Deaf for a brief time, but I was talking too much. And so they decided to transfer me to another program. It was on the same campus, but a different program that was a bilingual spoken and sign language program. And then I was mainstreamed in elementary, middle, and high school. And mainstream meaning I was the only deaf person surrounded by hearing students. I had an interpreter with me all day, every day, that went to every class and facilitated communication. Sometimes I would speak for myself, sometimes I would sign and the interpreter would voice for me. It depended on the context and the environment I was in, who I was with, whether or not my hearing aids were working that day. So I was able to go back and forth and switch modalities. And I went to college in Massachusetts. I went to Northeastern University. And the interpreter happens to be from Massachusetts as well. So that was a familiar thing. So in any case, went to Northeastern University. And again, I was mainstreamed at the university, but there were some deaf students as well at the university where I was able to speak, I was able to sign. And my hearing ability did decrease. I was not able to use hearing aids anymore. They no longer worked for me. And I wasn't really able to rely on my residual hearing, less on speech reading, and I was speaking less and signing more. And now my preferred method of communication is signing. It is rare that I speak now. After college, I went to graduate school at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. And at the same time, I was working, and that was early intervention, focusing on families birth to 3 years. And at first, I was working with families that were that had deaf children, didn't have deaf children, autism, neuroatypical, Down syndrome, physical delays, a variety of populations that I was interacting with. And my expertise started to dwindle to the deaf, to language acquisition, linguistic and culturally being deaf, supporting families in the system. And I started to work with families that only had deaf, hard of hearing, deaf blind, or deaf disabled with other disabilities, children. So when I completed my master's, it was in school counseling. I know that's odd. It wasn't related to EI, but I do have 2 certificates that specialize in early intervention. But I chose school counseling as my master's because I wanted to acquire skills of how to support families, how to support children, and I wanted to have that counseling background. And my major was family therapy, so that does correlate with EI. So I live in Colorado now, moved here, left Massachusetts after 14 years, moved to Colorado. I am in a PhD program here, and I am working on my dissertation related to leadership in educational equity for early childhood intervention. And the work I do, I have different roles. In Massachusetts, I did do EI, like I explained, and I dwindled down to focusing on the deaf. And then I worked at a deaf school in Massachusetts, and I ran their parent-infant program, ran that for 4 years. And when I moved here to Colorado, I established my own business as a consultant. I consult all over the country supporting various organizations and agencies on the federal, state level of how to run an effective program to support young deaf and hard of hearing, deaf blind, and deaf disabled children, and supporting those families with the bilingual philosophy. And I also work for the National Association for the Deaf, their education policy specialist. And that now my PhD is in policy, so I am familiar with educational law, IDEA, the ADA, and applying that to early intervention as well. My current role is working at Gallaudet University. I work remotely for now. And I am a program director for their graduate program specializing in infant, toddlers, and the family graduate program. So we have a certificate program, and we just established a new master's program as well. So I run both of those right now. So that's my background. Now I want to jump into the IFSP and advocacy and have a discussion, go through some things with you. I'm going to use the term deaf. Deaf children, deaf families, deaf community. Now, when I use that term deaf, it includes deaf, hard of hearing, deaf blind, as well as deaf with other disabilities. So all four of those categories are included. Children with cochlear implants, children with hearing aids, children who speak only, children who use cued speech, children who sign, children who speak and sign. So the whole gamut of various experiences will be included in this presentation. IFSP and advocacy applies to all deaf, hard of hearing, deaf blind, and deaf disabled children. And instead of going through that every time, I'm just going to say deaf to encompass the whole population. Just want to make sure we're on the same page about that. I'm going to share my slides right now. Just give me a moment to navigate that. Can everybody see the presentation? Fantastic. So this is my sign name. I'm going to talk about what an IFSP is and what are some special considerations related to IFSP, related to deaf children, and what are some resources, policies that you should be aware of related to the IFSP. And that's where the advocacy part comes in. What is an IFSP? That is an acronym for Individual Family Service Plan. An IFSP is a federal legal document. It's an agreement between the family and the early intervention service provider and other providers who will work with the family. Everyone has to agree on the service plan. It will be provided and there will be goals, and the family has to agree to work on those goals for their child. So it is a legal document. It is really important to have this and monitor it during your EI journey. The IFSP is your guide for services. What services you will be receiving, how often you will be receiving them, when, where, by who, what the goals are, all of that is included in the IFSP. It is also a way to follow the progress. With the IFSP, there will be reviews every 6 months, and new IFSP will be created annually. So your child is born, you find out your child is deaf, you start services at 3 months, you will have an IFSP for a 3-month-old. And going through to a year and 3 months, and then we will write a new IFSP. And then 2 years, 3 months, there'll be another IFSP. It'll be an annual IFSP, and there'll be a review every 6 months. In addition, every time you change a service, add a new provider, update goals, you will have to review the edits to the IFSP. It is really your most valued tool for your EI journey. The IFSP should be family-centered and strength-based. So the EI team can put together something to share to the family, but that's not what we do. It's important for team members to develop the IFSP in partnership with the family. It is a team process. I'll talk more about that. The next few slides, I'm going to touch on all the aspects of the IFSP, and I'm going to include some advocacy for each part. I'm not going to go expand on every section and everything that I've put on the slides. I really just want to touch on everything today so you get a general idea of the IFSP and the advocacy involved. First page of the IFSP will be the family page. And that page is the service provider and EI team collecting information about the family, what your priorities are, what your daily routine is like, what the strengths are, what the challenges are, and your favorite things about your child. All that is noted. And the family page for deaf and hard of hearing child, it is imperative to also collect information about the child's language environment. That includes, does the family already sign? Or do they speak English? Or do they speak another language? Does the child interact with people on a daily basis who speak a different language? Or maybe they have grandparents who only speak Spanish, for example. That is important information to include in the IFSP. Also want to touch on what the experience the family has had with deaf people, the deaf community in general. Maybe the family is immersed in the deaf community and they're familiar with it, or they never have been. It's important to note those things on the family page so the entire team understands where the family may be in their journey. And there's an important document that we use in this field. It is called, it was written by JCH, the Joint Committee for Infants Hearing, JCIH. That is an international group of experts in early intervention. And there are many recommendations given by JCIH for improving the quality of services. And one of those is the family page, including information about the hearing level of the child. And you want the whole team to understand what the child can and cannot access auditorily. You may notice that some teams, you may want to advocate for yourself and talk about a hearing level on the IFSP, and some teams say, oh no, that's a medical. No. It is important for the cultural and environmental experience of your child. So you need to advocate and let the team know. This is an international committee of experts who recommends that there's a discussion about hearing level with EI. So put your advocacy hat on, and during the IFSP meeting, guarantee that there is a consensus and everybody's on the same page. So that's the family page. And then next, you will see a description and assessment and evaluation report, summaries of the outcomes from the assessments and the evaluations. Some evaluations could include eligibility for EI. It could include other private evaluations and assessments that have been done by an audiologist, a private evaluation by them, or speech language evaluation. So add all of that in the IFSP. One thing that I strongly emphasize with the IFSP, especially with evaluations and assessments, it's also supported by national organizations for EI from 0 to 3. It's called 023. That's the name of the organization. The organization, not just for deaf and hard of hearing children, all children, the organization supports that if you evaluate any child who may have knowledge of multiple languages, you need a separate evaluation in each language. You must collect data and information about that child's proficiency in each language. Assessments and evaluations should not overlap between languages and should not just have a provider who's an expert in one language give the assessment and then translate it for another language. There should be an evaluation and assessment specifically for that child's language. If they know more than one, then each language should be assessed. So maybe trying to get communication skills for a 3-year-old. If that child uses both sign and spoken English, you must have an evaluation and an assessment provided in each language. Some EI teams that maybe are not aware of this multilingual recommendation may say, oh no, we can't afford it. We don't have a team for that. They're still required to find the resources to provide the family with that kind of support and supporting that multilingual evaluation. That is important. It is imperative for evaluations and assessments. Then the next part of the IFSP is goals. The child and the family will work with the team to develop various goals, and there'll be benchmarks established. So how do you know if the child is succeeding and reaching the goal if you don't have a benchmark? So again, I am emphasizing repeatedly, the goal, if it's related to language communication, there should be separate goals of whatever language the child is using. If the goal is ASL fluency and spoken English fluency, then you need a goal for spoken English, you need a goal for ASL. Those goals should be separate. Some teams maybe are not familiar with deaf language acquisition, and they're going to try to write a goal that includes everything in it. For example, one typical thing that happens is the child will be able to ask for what they want using 2 words. Okay, so if the child is learning both sign and spoken English, then how do you know if they're mastering English or sign language? How do you know that? Maybe the child who is learning both doesn't have the same development in ASL and spoken English. Maybe in one language, the goal is not appropriate for that because the child is not going to be able to get to that point just yet. So we want to make sure that we develop language goals that fit the child, their skill in each language. This includes children who are acquiring 2 spoken languages. You should have a goal for one spoken language and a goal for the other spoken language. And another just tip for advocacy. Now, if you notice that your goals are all language, and focusing on communication just because your child is deaf, that should not be happening. Encourage goals that focus on the whole child's development. Social emotional development, peer interactions, self-care, self-advocacy. So those are appropriate goals to add. And you can also add family-centered goals. The family wants to learn ASL. The family wants to find resources to support functioning literacy. Those are goals that you can put on the IFSP, and it supports the family. It is a family-centered document. That advocacy, it's like, do you need a policy to talk to the EI team? The IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, the EI service provider is there because of IDEA. So you can point out IDEA says that my services must be family-centered. That's another advocacy tip. for the goal page. Now, the service grid. The service grid actually is a grid. You will see a grid on the page. And all of the child's services will be listed. Every single service will be listed in the grid. That grid will also include frequency of how often you get the services. Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Is it biweekly? Who is providing that service? Which specialist? Will it be a speech language pathologist? Will it be a teacher of the deaf? Will it be a physical therapist? Will it be a social worker? Who will be providing that service? And also, it will be noted as to how long. Will it be an hour in length, 2 hours in length? Will it be 30 minutes for a session? That will all be written on the grid. The service grid should be included if there's any deaf adult involvement, a deaf mentor, a deaf coach, an ASL tutor. That should be added on the grid. Each state is run a little differently. I don't know what Tennessee does, but every state has a different contract. It depends on who is covering the service. Is EI covering it, or if a different agency is covering it? It depends. But for the most part, you will want to document any deaf mentor, put that on the service grid. And you will want to document any ASL services on the grid. If you have a private tutor that EI covers, or a speech therapy, a therapist who signs, you want to request that the team add that on the service grid. Be as specific as possible. Which language is it? Because at 3, when it's time for EI services to transition to the ISP, you want to document everything that your child is receiving for services to justify an accommodation on the IEP. If there are empty spots, it doesn't say ASL, doesn't say spoken language or Spanish services, all that's missing, then you show up to the IEP meeting and you say you want X, Y, and Z, and the IEP team says, why do you want that? Your child didn't have that before. So you want that evidence that my child has been receiving this over the last 2 years through EI, weekly spoken Spanish services and support, and you want that to continue on the IEP. So the service grid becomes a tool to advocate for your child's services after you leave the EI program. Now, next part of the IFSP is transition. The transition page is related to what happens at age 3. EI is over at 3, you transition to the next stage of your journey. And the transition page will list every meeting that EI has with your family, explaining the transition, listing the various resources, organizations that can support your transition during and after the child becoming age 3. And an advocacy tip for the transition part is you want to ask the EI team to put you in contact with other families. Because what happens, and this is something that many families really feel disgruntled about. So the EI is over at age 3, you're cut off, and then you lose that support. You lose your team. You lose people that you've been depending on for 3 years. You lose the family connections that you get through EI. And the IFSP is different than a different process. It's family-centered. IFSPs are family-centered and supportive. With the IEP, you get less of that. There's more focus on the child. There are clear boundaries. The education system is separate from the family. So you want to ask your team to help you find a family network so that you can still have family support after you're done with EI. Those families that you connect with after the age of 3 can also give you ideas, tips, organization referrals, support. You can, maybe have social activities with kids the same age. And it's an informal connection, but it's still a connection after the child is age 3. You want to specifically ask for family networks during that transition. That's an advocacy tip right there. Second to last part of the IFSP is resources. You will be noting various resources on the IFSP. So you can ask the EI team to find resources for you, a deaf mentor, a deaf adult, people of various backgrounds, a family network opportunities, ASL classes, private evaluations, private assessments. Maybe you feel like your team is not qualified, is not really proficient in deaf language acquisition. And spoken or signed languages. You have the right to request a private evaluation, and the EI should cover that. And that's related to IDEA. Remember, that's the magic word. So you want to advocate for yourself and ask for various things and have those resources included in the IFSP. And there are some specific organizations. There's the Leclerc Center at Gallaudet University, and their focus is on K through 12 and early intervention services and support and training people all over the country to support deaf and hard of hearing children. There's the American Society for Deaf Children, ASDC, that is a family-centered organization, which I highly recommend. They have so many fun events and conferences and various workshops and presentations and resources. It's really great for families who use spoken or signed languages or both. And so there's a whole variety of organizations. And then the last page is the signatures. Now, one thing that I emphasize with this page, do not sign it if you're feeling rushed, or if you're feeling like your team is not listening to you, or you feel like the goals do not fit what you want. If you do not feel like the IFSP really has included the family as the lead, you do not have to sign. You can say, I'm not comfortable signing this right now. I want a week to review all the services, make sure if everything's appropriate, of whether or not you included my requests, my goals. I want to reconvene, meet again. You control the IFSP as the family. You're not satisfied with it, don't sign it. Sometimes they say, oh, we only have a week, we're running out of time. Do not feel pressured. Do not sign it. Request the second meeting and ask the team to put that in writing that you requested a second meeting, and that will extend your deadline. The team may pressure you to meet something. You don't have to do that. So that's an advocacy tip for you as well. For the signatures, it seems simple, but that holds a lot of power, and the family should not sign the page if they are uncomfortable with how the IFSP processes go. So that was my very condensed presentation. I'm going to turn it back over to Briella, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, thank you so much for all of that information. It was amazing. And the point is, it was just so much for me, but I'm sure the audience feels just as overwhelmed as I do with all the information. But it was, oh, excuse me, it was not too much for me. I'm hoping the audience feels the same way. Definitely an interpreter error there. It's really important for our audience to know that they have rights. And sometimes, you know, people can feel overwhelmed with the entire system and all the appointments required, the new information, terminology, agencies, referrals. It's so much to handle. The bottom line, and at the end of the day, is that people have rights and you have control. And there are things that you need to do. I would like to open the floor for any questions in this Q&A portion of our meeting. please allow the families to ask questions first. You can open your video and sign if you would like, and I can spotlight you. If you prefer to chat, to type your question in chat, if you want to use your microphone, whatever you would like to do, it is entirely up to you.
I wanted to add something. I am happy to answer questions about my work, about the IFSP, about advocacy, or just about me in general too, and my experiences as a deaf person. I am an open book.
Bring it on. Hold on a moment. Okay, go ahead.
Hey, this is Toby. I wanted to ask you actually several questions. The first question is, you said that they should have an evaluation in each language on the IFSP, so spoken and ASL. Does that also apply to the IEPs?
Should, yes. Ideally, but usually does not happen. When they start the when you start the IEP meeting, the first time you ever have one, I tend to advocate for separate language evaluations. Now, specifically for the IEP part, my background, considering my background, so the family has the right to request a private evaluation. Same thing with the IFSP. So what tends to happen is the school district will say, we don't have someone who's an expert in ASL evaluation. We can provide English only. So the family can request, okay, we can't meet my needs, then you will have to look and find an external evaluator who can provide the ASL evaluation. The family has the right to make that request. Once the request is made, the school district must honor it. But if they can't meet it within their team, within the district, then they have to find an outside person and they have to cover the cost to provide that evaluation. One loophole is if the family already has a previous evaluation. So let's say you're coming from EI, going into the IEP, and if EI already has an evaluation, then you can apply that to the IEP. You can ask the IEP team to consider the evaluation that was done previously. They're not required to consider it. They could say, no, we want our own. Okay, that's fine. But the negative about this is the district, once the request is made, they can choose who they hire to do that evaluation. Now, that means the district will pick someone who is proficient in ASL, who's certified to do a signing evaluation. Not always. They're not required to do that. They're only required to bring someone in. So sometimes they'll bring someone in who's not certified, who's not an expert. But the family will have to accept it. I mean, they can complain, but once the district provides it, the evaluation is the evaluation. So there are pros and cons to making that kind of request.
Does that answer your question, Toby?
Yes, I have more of it. Let other people ask. Yeah.
Thank you. There is a question from Danielle, and she says, I'm curious, when did your hearing start to get worse? Our son has hearing aids, and we aren't sure at the moment if his hearing loss will progress. I also wanted to ask if he would like to have an interpreter. We would like to have an interpreter at medical appointments. Should that be a goal on the IFSP?
Great question. I love that second question. I'll answer that in a moment. Back to the first question. My hearing situation is a little complicated. I was born, and I wasn't identified until I was 9 months old. I was born before the newborn hearing screening became mandatory. I was born before that. So there was no screening when I was born. So my family was stumped and not sure if I was born deaf or born able to hear, and then I lost my hearing. So there's no evidence and there was nothing to observe. So at 9 months, I was diagnosed as profoundly deaf. Looking at the audiogram, my hearing was down here. It wasn't even on the chart. I was profoundly deaf. Family went ahead and tried hearing aids. And for some reason, the hearing aids worked. And then over time realized that my hearing was only related to my lip reading. So if I could lip read, and then my audiological scores went up. But if I wasn't lip reading, if my mouth was covered, then the score would go down. So that was odd that my auditory skills were based on my lip reading ability. So that was a very interesting and unique situation. But I went ahead with hearing aids. I liked the sound of music and I liked hearing things. I heard enough to pair it up with lip reading and know what was going on. So over time, one ear was getting worse. I wasn't able to hear, it wasn't working. So we tried switching hearing aids. I'm showing my age here, but I grew up with analog hearing aids. And at that time, I switched over to digital hearing aids and whew, my ears and brain could not handle the noise level and the accuracy because I was so used to analog. Digital just was too much for my brain. And that's where my hearing just was done. I couldn't wear hearing aids at all. That switch, something happened with that switch. So maybe it was a hearing loss, or maybe it was just my auditory skills decreased. I can't recognize which one it is. Because you have to remember with hearing, compared to your auditory skills, it's different. You know, with the beep beeps and things like that in a booth, I could hear, but what people are saying, what language, that was decreasing. But the testing, it was pretty steady. So I'm not sure what caused that. But anyway, it got to the point where I could not tolerate the hearing aids. It was hurting. My brain couldn't handle things well. And then one was canceling out the other. And then I couldn't hear in one, but I could hear in the other. It was just, I just stopped using the hearing aids. It was too much to maneuver and navigate. And I just started signing and lip reading, writing, and, you know, using a phone to text. Everything worked out fine, but that's my answer. I don't know if my hearing actually got worse or my auditory skills got worse. So I hope that answers your question.
Perfect.
So the second question, you can add to the IFSP that the family wants resources to learn about how to use an interpreter in a medical appointment or out in the community. Yes, that is definitely a goal. That is a family-centered goal. You can say, I want, not that I want you to provide an interpreter, want the family to learn how to find an interpreter, how to request an interpreter, how to use an interpreter during a medical appointment. That can be a goal. Now, for that goal, it means that you have to have a deaf mentor. You have to have a deaf person that teaches you how to do that. I mean, who else is going to teach you to do that? An EI person who's never worked with an interpreter before is not going to do that. So you need a deaf person. You need a deaf person who's familiar, maybe a VR counselor or something like that. Someone who knows about interpreting, knows how to work the system, and goes to the family's home and joins the family at a medical appointment and describes how to use an interpreter, how to request an interpreter, and who to contact to make the request. So you can add that as a goal.
Great.
Was that clear?
Absolutely. Wonderful. Are there any more questions from our family? I know Toby had more questions that she would like. Here's your chance, Toby.
This is Toby. Last question is so we have already transitioned from our IFSP to the IEP, but we were denied an IEP. So my question is, with like certain goals and that kind of stuff, how do I advocate for him to say, this is what we're doing in the deaf mentor program? He is in a deaf school. How do I translate that over to an elementary school?
All right. So I'm sorry, it seems like it's a complicated and sticky situation. I always, think about the family who's gone through EI and then all of a sudden they're not getting an IEP. Unfortunately, it happens more than we realize to a lot of deaf children, and it's really a bad activity in general. So looking at the EI portion of services and Part B IEP services, early intervention services are intended to be more preventative, to provide as many resources as possible. Now, Part B of the IEP is more reactionary. They wait until there's a delay and then they'll provide services. That has been the approach. I disagree with that, but that is how it's done. So how you can approach this, your advocacy approach would be to say, I am concerned and afraid that my child will lag behind because to the point where the only reason that they're successful to the point they are today is because they had ABC services. And if they don't have these services, they may fall back. So a lot of districts could say, oh, well, we got to see them fail. So that's where it gets frustrating. And it's nice to have the advocate join your team. Do you already have an advocate?
No.
Oh, I encourage you to get an advocate. Maybe Briella can give you some ideas for an advocate.
I'm looking. Yes, Briella says, absolutely.
If your child has ever received EI services, a deaf mentor, speech, sign, physical therapy, anything related to EI services, those services are why your child is successful. And if they say you don't need an IEP, say, okay, so they have a foundation that's going to be cracking. And so that's the concept. You want to make sure to keep that solid foundation. You really need to emphasize that. And you also can make a request for a trial period of 8 weeks. And the trial period of going into the school for the deaf or going into a specific classroom, try it out for 8 weeks and have a pre and post test to gather data to see if there are any improvements or if it's steady. And then 8 weeks later, they improve. So great. Okay, there's evidence right there. It's not going to cost a school anything to do that, to test it out. So that's something that you can try. Doesn't always work, but you could try if you want to reach out and have a trial period. Most important thing for your child is to monitor their progress. Contact the teacher, request reports, request daily reports even. Monitor the listening fatigue. A lot of teachers maybe say, oh, your child has had a difficult day after lunch. It tends to be listening fatigue. And you can say, I want an IEP to approach that. And right away, you can request it. Doesn't do well with the environment, needs an accommodation, needs a listening break, needs speech therapy, needs somebody to help understand the environmental sounds, the access. The teacher needs to be trained, all those things. So you really need to closely monitor, get even daily reports and collect that data yourself, because the school's not going to do it.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Toby, for asking that question. I know it's tough being in that position right now, especially as parents. They feel like, they want to do something, they want to do as much as possible, but the system won't let them. So I empathize with you. Hey, I got your back. Okay, I would like to open the floor to professionals and other community members that may have questions for Sarah. There's a few minutes left, so now is your time. I do have a question I would like to ask Sarah. Do you have any tips or advice for professionals working on IEPs or IFSPs? What should they consider when working with a family?
That's a good question. My number one thing to remind myself about when I go into an IFSP or IEP is always put the family first. If you build a strong relationship with the family, I will often say, could I sit next to you during the meeting? Are you okay with that? I always check with the family. If I go in and join the meeting, the family's like, I go, hey, do you mind? And the family tends to say, yeah, come join the meeting. And during the meeting, I will check in with them. I have no issue with stopping the entire meeting and say, hold on a second. Do you understand what's going on? Do you have any questions? I will literally interrupt people if they're going on and on. I go, hold on a minute. Things are not clear. Okay, let's do one at a time. Does the family have any questions? Did they miss anything? Do they want us to go back? I advocate for the family by interrupting the meeting and pausing the meeting if needed. Sometimes people need a physical pause, and parents will say, thank you. You know, I'm doing all right now, but yes, I missed this or missed that. So it's really important that I use that approach to direct everything to the family. And also I do have this discussion with the family beforehand saying, hey, if I see something, do you want me to be assertive? Do you want me to sit back? What do you want my role to be? I discuss that with the family. And most people say, yes, please, if you see something, you know, intervene. Or some families say, no, leave it up to me, just sit back and watch. And I go, no problem. So it's family-centered, family first. We as professionals, it's easy for us because we know what we're doing to bulldoze the family, but they don't know what's happening. This is their first time. You know, we do this repeatedly as professionals, but it's new for the family. So we really need to focus on the family first.
That sounds like wonderful, perfect advice. And I'm sure that the audience agrees. We'll keep that in mind moving forward. We have about 5 minutes left. Any final questions from anyone in the listening audience? I see someone. No? Well, we can go ahead and start a wrap up. Sarah, do you have any final words or anything that you would like to share before we close tonight's session?
Well, thank you for your time this evening. I do appreciate you taking this hour out of your busy schedules to sit with me this evening. You can contact me at any time. Briella does have my contact information. And you can get in touch with me anytime, anywhere, and I'm glad to advocate and help out as much as I can.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your knowledge. I know you as well are busy, but thanks for taking the time to come here tonight and explain to our audience all the things that you have to share with us here in Tennessee.
Thank you.
Everyone, feel free to open your cameras and say goodbye and thank you and